All right. Yes, that works. Perfect. Okay, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to this new lecture of the lecture series Lens of Writing. So today we are welcoming Andreas Stauder, who is professor of Egyptian linguistics and philology at the École pratique des hautes études PSL in Paris. And Andreas, prior to joining the PHE, has been a researcher of the Swiss National Science Foundation in Basel and Chicago. He holds a PhD in Egyptology from the University of Basel and 2 MA degrees in Egyptology and Assyriology from the University of Geneva, as well as a prix de composition from the Conservatoire Supérieur de Musique de Genève. His research focuses on Egyptian historical grammar and linguistics in a typological perspective, ancient Egyptian literature and inscriptions, and Egyptian hieroglyphic writing in the comparative study of ancient writing systems, with a focus on the early developments of writing systems and on extended practice of complex writing systems such as enigmatic writing. His publications include the earlier Egyptian passive voice and perspective, linguistic dating of Middle Egyptian literary text, and together with the Mayanist Stephen Houston, he has written an essay on what common elements define the 2 major hieroglyphic traditions, the Maya and the Egyptian, What is a Hieroglyph, published in L'Homme 233. Sorry. Andreas Stauder is the scientific editor of the area Language Writing Text in the UCLA Encyclopedia of Egyptology and the editor-in-chief of the new series Writing in Ancient World. He has previously been the director of the program Scripta PSL, History and Practices of Writing, and the co-editor of the module Materiality and Semantics of Writing in the research clusters ICONES. So, after this brief introduction, Andreas, whenever you want, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. So I hope the screen is well. Can you just confirm this? You're using the PowerPoint?
Yes, I can see your PowerPoint.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Gael. It's a pleasure to be there with many old friends in the air, even if only virtually. And thanks to all the audience for being there so late in the day for this very early stuff. So let's get started. The scene is well known. We are in Abydos in the necropolis of El-Ka'ab, more specifically Tomb UJ, time Naqada IIIA, 33rd century BCE. A unique tomb at the time with multi-chambered lined brick and very rich contents, even if plundered. So what we're really interested in today is these 3 types of sign-bearing artifacts. Sealings associated with wine jars, imported wine at the time, so-called wavy-handled ware, probably containing precious oils or fats, and finally tags in bone and ivory, possibly associated with precious cloth. And based on this, well, is this the earliest Egyptian writing? Do we have here a last frontier in decipherment? Are we going to the moon? This is certainly one major thesis, has been the dominant thesis for the first 20 years after the discovery of this material. It's a bipartite thesis. On the one hand, we have writing. On the other hand, it is an administrative function. So it looks like writing. It is found in context in which writing is documented later, and it can be decoded Abu Elephantini, Basel Bobastis, Jugerach, Mountain of the West, allegedly. Moreover, it is associated with commodities, and you find numerical notation, hence administrative. That looks all pretty coherent. And so it nicely fits the so-called civilizational package that associates writing with social complexity, with the state, with administration, craft specialization, urbanism, and so much more. Civilizational, indeed, that's a very big word. And it is a narrative that provides a deep genealogy to our own modernity in general, and especially in the 20th century, which has been a time of information technology revolutions. That's all very coherent, perhaps a little bit too coherent if you look more closely at this. On the right-hand side, Uruk, southern Mesopotamia, you have what has been called a megacity in the late 4th millennium. Quite clearly, in Egypt at the time, you have entirely different paths to trajectories to urbanism, and certainly nothing like a megacity at any place. If you look at the signs themselves, the graphic encyclopedia is entirely different. In Uruk, you have many signs that represent vessels, which can be marked by in different manners, diacritically, with hatchings and so forth. Whereas in Egypt at the time, you mainly have animals, many birds of various sorts, majestic, powerful, dominant, dangerous animals. The relation to the commodities is also entirely different. In Uruk, you have signs that reference commodities. Whereas in Egypt, you have signs that do not reference commodities, but instead stand on, are marked directly on those commodities. And finally, the materiality is also as different as could be, because in Uruk you have clay, whereas in Egypt you have hard materials which are work intensive, and that means something as well. Speaking of readings, here you have Abu Elephantini, and that shows you how the decipherment in inverted commas works. You look and take a spelling from, in this case, well, that's the inscription of Weni. 1,000 years later, you compare it, and then you read Elephantini. The trouble, however, is if you look at contemporary material, here, for example, a rock inscription in the Kenaben, late 4th millennium, you have the same graphic form on a standard in a vessel twice in the desert. So that rules pretty much out any reading like Elephantini. And here I would like to insist that there's an issue of method. If you have material from the late 4th millennium, you first have to address it synchronically with other material from the late 4th millennium, rather than project back readings that date to a millennium later. All the more so, since in the late 3rd millennium, we have writing for sure, whereas in the late 4th millennium, we actually do not know to begin with whether this is writing or not. And by projecting it back, you, in a kind of circular fashion, answer your question before even have asked it. Regarding the issue of the administrative function, so the idea goes like here, you have these plants or trees, and they stand for plantation, domain, or production unit of some sort associated with perhaps a king elephant. While if you push this, well, here you would have a domain of King Jackal, which is already kind of weird. And then you have again the plant associated with icons of power, the serach on the left-hand side, the scorpion and the rosette on the right-hand side in the deserts. And I think the desert is a pretty unlikely place for a production unit. The main argument against this administrative thesis is the materiality itself. You have here a work-intensive, sumptuous materiality. You have the tags, they are carved, and then they're additionally filled with a paste, which is pretty redundant if this is about conveying administrative information. Or here you have a fish on the vessels, and if you count the number of strokes or lines, you have in excess of 100, which again is as redundant as it gets if it were only about conveying utilitarian information. And finally, there are the signs themselves. As you can see here, by comparison with one of the ivory pieces from the main deposit in Yarakonpolis, these signs in UJ, they are deeply embedded in contemporary visual culture. They are loaded with significations, they're highly symbolic in some ways, and they are just too thick, dense semiotically to be demoted to a status of mere instrumental administration. Okay, so it's not writing, so there are no administrative functions here. What do we have in UJ? And that's the harder part, of course, because deconstructing previous hypotheses, well, we can do that, but reconstructing somewhere else on rubble takes more time. So we might as well begin with the graphic repertoire itself and observe that it is very much unlike hieroglyphs, contrarily to what has often been claimed. For example, you have very few human signs, which has have 3 human signs, and you have no graphic decomposition of the animal or human body. What I mean by this is here you have a Nubian ibex or perhaps a Barbary sheep, right? But as you can see by comparison with this ivory from Yarragon-Polis, this is actually a trophy of the animal, here displayed on a sort of niched or buttressed building. So what we have is not the animal graphically decomposed, but the trophy represented as a whole, which is radically different. And here you have another instance with a gazelle, again a trophy, and on the right-hand side, the hunter, just to show you that hunt is a very socially important practice at the time. Think of the hunter's palette, and you find that embedded in the graphic encyclopedia of UJ. So what we really have is many animals, dangerous, powerful, majestic, charged with symbolism. And we have signs that are embedded in contemporary visual culture, prestigious forms, in other words. For example, here you have a falcon on what looks like a crescent. And at first might seem like a symbol of the sky. You might think anachronistically of Nemti. It's not that at all. If you look at the contemporary material here, you see that it is actually a falcon wielding a throw stick. And that sign of the falcon wielding a throw stick, you see it again on this limestone vessel from Yarragon-Polis, where if you look at the details, well, the image is not so neat, but he's actually holding it with his claws. And below you have a scorpion, which is also present in UJ, so it's coherent. And what they have in common, these two forms, is that they both deliver instantaneous, inescapable, and potentially lethal blows. The one from above and the other one from the ground. So let's play with these signs a little more. In this slightly later scene from Saqqara, 150 years later, you have a falcon with the throw stick again. Then you have these vegetal elements, which is not a triple yod, of course, which you find again in UJ. And in UJ, you find it also on the vessels associated with the scorpion, which is itself on the tanks again. So there is some coherence here, even if we do not understand the signification of this vegetal elements, or at least I do not understand it. And falcon on the throw stick, you have it again among the forces that capture the enemies for the king on Scorpion's mace head. Where you also have this, the min symbol, which is again found in UJ and on our Saqqara shield. And the min symbol is interesting because it has recently been shown by Jean-Guillaume Pelletier that this is not a fossil or anything else, but a fulgurite, that is sand vitrified by lightning. The lightning strikes the sand in the desert and it becomes this glass-like item. And the lightning, we have it in UJ. Here we have actually a sign representing lightning. And if you look at it in detail, you even see that the lightning is striking the ground. So it's the action of the lightning that is represented here. And it's even more subtle than that, because the lightning, well, there's this kind of bulb, and through iconographic parallels that I can't show here today, you can see that it is also a snake. So it's a head of a snake at the same time. A snake, of course, is also a symbol of aggressive potency. All of these mutually reinforcing elements. So if we sum up what we have so far, we have this striking lightning slash snake. We have the min symbol, which is itself the impact of the lightning on the sand in the desert. And we have the falcon with the throw stick. All of these are forces that strike from above. And we have the scorpion, which is a force that strikes from below, all delivering these inescapable lethal blows. So it's a pretty aggressive graphic encyclopedia so far. What about the elephant on the hills? Well, first off, there are many elephants in UJ. So here you have two more elephant signs. One recumbent and the other one this elephant-like shrine. And this elephant on the hills is part of a broader set of forms. Here you have wild bulls on hills on an ivory from Yarragon-Polis. So you have a recurrent graphic pattern, we might call it, with a powerful or wild animal standing or marching or trampling on hills of the Gabon. And if you go 200 years pre-UJ, you have, of course, this famous cemetery in Yarragon-Polis HK6, which attests to the capturing, keeping alive, then killing and burying of wild animals. And if we go 200 years later than UJ, you have this piece with the wild bull on the hills being lassoed by the now broken away king. So that it becomes part of a royal ritual of hunt. And at the time of UJ itself, you have, again, I showed this before, this rock inscription from the Wadi Magar, where our emblem is on a standard in a boat and repeated in the place where just a few generations later you could have the royal name, which leads to the hypothesis that at least at this moment in time, it could have been a royal emblem. Putting all these things together, what we have in this elephant above the hills is probably a notion of the forces of the wild, untamed, which are, however, dominated by human agency. And that's what we certainly have already in HK6, 200 years before UJ, and therefore appropriated by some kind of power, which power increasingly becomes a royal power. Now turning to the way we handled where the vessels, the scorpion we already had. So on the left-hand side, you also have a bucranium on a pole. This, you find it in rock art, Jebel Chauti, for example, associated with the scorpion. Observe also the long-legged waders, these birds, saddle-billed storks. We'll see more of them later on. All sorts of signs in Jebel Chauti that you find also in UJ. And the bucranium monopole, you also have it in this inscription of Al-Khawiyan, which I will say much more later on, where it probably marks a place and therefore is a sign of an appropriation of a place by some group of people. Let's not forget that we're just on the opposite side of the river relative to Hierakonpolis here. We also have this lambis. So it's a kind of shell or conch from the Red Sea, very impressive type of shell. And that you can find it, for example, on the Coptus colossi, associated with a mint symbol. And so here you already wonder whether it might stand for some kind of a numinous force. And this is kind of confirmed by what you have 1,000 years later in Marsagawasis. There's a votive depot of several hundreds of these shells dating to the Middle Kingdom, but nonetheless, most probably a numinous force of some sort. And now the issue of how the signs are composed with one another. Because if you look at this, let's say naively, you would say, okay, they are composed with one another. That is like syntagmatics, paradigmatics. It looks like writing, so it's writing after whole, perhaps. Well, after having insisted so much already on this aggressive potency of the signs, on their numinous qualities associated with these, we might have perhaps a different look now at these. But there still remains the issue of how they are composed with each other. We have some examples that I'm discussing now. So, for example, here we have two signs that are together, but these are part of a group of signs that are always coming together. They are always forming a pair. And like 150 years later, you have again this zoomorphic shrine associated not with a recumbent elephant, but with a feline animal of some sort. So it's a different animal at that time. But in each time, it's really the shrine and its guardian. So it's an iconographic composition. You have two graphic forms that are discrete, but that are making together one composite emblem. So it's actually not so much a combination. So here you have the elephant on the hills with the plant. So that is really a combination. So what about that? Well, you have it also with the jackal. The jackal, just a few generations later, would be associated with kingship. Think of Upuaut, for example, the opener of the ways for the king, striding in front of the king. And the elephant on hills, we already had this idea that it could be a symbol of the wild force of nature dominated by human agency and associated with royalty. And here you have it associated with the scorpion and the rosette, all of which are symbols of kingship at the time in this newly discovered inscription of the Wadi al-Malik, just northeast of Aswan. So here we really have all of these are emblems, and the plants themselves are emblems that are composed with one another. So there is composition of emblems associated with kingship. And here, perhaps the most spectacular example, the subtle build stalk, which within the UJ tags can be combined with no less than 4 different signs. My first observation is to see here, for example, on the Carnarvon handle, that a stork is a very majestic animal. That's true in nature, but that is also how it was seen in the late 4th millennium. Here you have it associated with lions, elephants, and giraffes, which means something to about ancient perceptions of the saddle-billed stork. And on these 2 tags of UJ, and on the right-hand side in the Costanza comb, you find it associated with a gazelle head, which you find on the Coptus colossi. So that is to do with numinous force, the min emblem, which is to do with numinous force anyway, and the bat emblem on the Costanza comb likewise. So this subtle-billed stork is recurrently associated with emblems of numinous force, leading some credence to the hypothesis that the subtle-billed stork, a majestic animal, stands not linguistically, but if you wish, ideographically or iconographically, for a notion like the manifestation of a power, and then comes the power, be it the gazelle, the min symbol, or the bat symbol. So, and here the crested ibis, or I should mention this, perhaps it is a secretary bird. There is a debate about that. It's not settled. I'm not going into this today, but I'd say conventionally for today it's a crested ibis, even though I'm not sure. So you have this crested ibis in the middle. On the left-hand side, it strides on hills, and on the right-hand side, it stands in front of a snake on a pole on a hill. These are nice combinations. And in the El Khawi rock inscription, you again have the crested ibis, flanked by 2 of these subtle-billed storks that we had just before, and that perhaps stand for notions of manifestation of numinous power of some sort, and quite clearly the center of this antithetic composition. Goes a little further, because if you look in detail in the El Khawi rock inscription, you also have the snake, just next to the subtle-billed stork to the right. Then comes the question, where are the hills on the El Khawi inscription? Have them on the tags twice, not at El Khawi. Really? Well, you actually have them. It's the rock itself. It's an escarpment that dominates the valley from very much high above, and that sits at the interface of 2 spaces, the desert and the valley. You don't need to represent it on the rock because you are in that very space. And therefore, if you look at the flanking subtle-billed storks, which stand for manifestation of power for some sort, and if you take into account that at El Khawi we are in this probably liminal space, well, that might be the kind of significations that we're dealing with here, without being able to be very much more precise. However, once we have that, we can go back to the signs, to the tags on the right-hand side of the slide, where you have also this snake above hills thing associated with the lightning. And remember that the lightning is one of these signs that stand for an escapable force that deliver a lethal blow. And there's a clear parallelism with our crested bird, so that the crested bird in some sense must also stand for some force which is coherent with the fact. So here you have the parallelism, which is coherent with the fact that it is surrounded by these 2 subtle-billed storks. Right. So we're getting somewhere, but perhaps we should also observe that we really have 4 different realizations or elaborations of the same motif. You can have the crested bird, or perhaps it's a secretary bird after all, alone, UJ 130. You can have it only with the hills, 133 on the left, with the snake on the hills, 135 on the right, or additionally flanked by the subtle-billed storks in the El Khawi rock inscription. So this is really an iconographic logic that can be elaborated to various degrees, very explicit or much less explicit. And so what about that? Here you have this long-necked bird, perhaps a crane, above an elephant. That has long resisted any kind of interpretation. But once we learn looking at these things visually, I think we can go somewhere. First, observe that the elephant walks on the earth, and the long-necked bird is a bird, so it's somehow associated with the air. And if you look, for example, at the Abu Zaidan knife handle, which has a very complex composition, while on the top row on the one side, you have elephant above snakes. And on the top row of the other side, don't see it that well, but it's a bird, probably a vulture, who is attacking snakes. So there's a parallelism of these two top rows, associating an elephant with a bird. Just the same association that we have in UJ number 52. There's this beautiful palette from the Louvre, which shows a palm tree surrounded by two giraffes. It's a common motif at the time. Would have shown 15 different objects with that. And so how does this work? Well, probably we have to think that these, it's entirely unnaturalistic, of course. These two types of beings belong to different spaces. The palm tree lives in the valley, and the giraffe lives in the desert. So you couldn't find them next to each other in real life. So they are opposites based on their habitats, but they also have some parallelism in a sense that they are both the tallest beings in their own respective spaces. And this is something that is visually emphasized here on this tablet with these exaggerated long necks and exaggerated high palm trees. So you really see it, I'm not making it up. And they are further opposites because a palm tree is domesticated and it even needs man to reproduce itself, whereas a giraffe is undomesticated and cannot be domesticated. So I have a contrast between the untamed and the domesticated here as well. If we go back to our tag, we have two different spaces, the earth with the elephant, the sky with the bird. The sky is, of course, above the elephant, so that makes sense. And it's a very large bird, perhaps a crane, so you have the two most majestic animals in their respective habitats, plus probably a number of other significations that we absolutely do not understand, but that are certainly present here. So we have what I like to call an homology of complementaries. They are complementary things, the bird, the elephant, based on the habitat, but they're also homologous on the fact that they are both the most majestic animals, and they're probably more complementary dimensions and more homologous dimensions that we do not see. And here, by the way, we could go back to this limestone vessel that I showed initially, because you have these two types of striking forces, falcon with a throw stick from the air and the scorpion from the ground, which is again an homology of complementaries, just like in UJ number 52. It's the same kind of a visual combinatorial logic. Right, so now we have been looking a lot at signs, but a little bit should be said about contexts as well. So Naqada IIIA, 33rd century BCE, a lot is happening then. And to make it very short, what we see is an increasingly sophisticated visual culture for which the Davies School on the right-hand side could stand. And it's sophisticated in the sense that the significations are complex, but also in the sense that hard materials are being worked in subtractive techniques, like this form of carving, contrasting with painting, which is an additive technique. And well, you easily imagine how these subtractive techniques are more restricted, more prestigious, generally speaking, than just painting and more generally additive techniques. And as these, for example, rock reliefs in Jebel Chauti and El Khawi further illustrate, we are at a time when a coalescing royal power is increasingly concerned with displaying itself. That's a general context, and if we go to UJ, more specifically, we have to think of a number of collective occasions associated with this material. First, of course, is the burial of the king. First, let's say most evident, because it's in a sense last, the burial of the king. And the burial of the king is not just that at some point this material and the inscriptions have been made to disappear in a socially staged occasion, and are not seen anymore. There's also the fact that any barrier leaves a trace. There's a social memory among the participants later on, and that even extends further to all those who might not have been there, but to whom one might be talking about what was happening there. Before that, we have a visibility of marked objects, perhaps because they were exposed. That we cannot know. It's speculation, but entirely possible. And then there's the making of the signs themselves. So there are the occasions of making. And on various grounds, it can be shown that this happened in Abydos itself. And there are hints that this might have been a collective occasion with several people involved, perhaps even a ritualized occasion. David Wengrow in particular has written about that. We have this series of collective occasions of practice associated with the signs. And closing in even further to the artifacts themselves, well, they are distinguished by this very peculiar type of sumptuosity. First off, they're evidently marking exclusive commodities. It's one thing, but the signs themselves are exclusive, and they're exclusive in two senses. First, they're making material dimensions of carving, filling with paste, and so forth, and also the selection of the signs, the inventory itself. And we do not want to imagine that these signs were a currency that was widely circulated in society at the time. Quite to the contrary, these signs were increasingly restricted and therefore increasingly valuable. That's how you create value in general. And finally, we have an extraordinary assemblage of such signs. So if you look at contemporary objects, you can find, for example, in Howie, 5 of the signs that there are in UJ, a knife handle, Copter Scholastic, or Stamnacum, ivories from Hierakonpolis. You find many of the signs that are in UJ, 3, 4, 2, 5 signs together, but never more than that. Whereas in UJ, you have all these signs collected as if UJ was sort of siphoning up all this graphic riches of the time. And so the signs in UJ are not unique. It's the assemblage of the signs that is really unique. And so there's a statement revolving around graphic wealth that is being made here, along with the more general statement on wealth in the two. So what is UJ? By way of a short summary, we have practices of marking precious and exclusive commodities with precious signs, prestigious signs that are indices of their own exclusive status. So in a sense, they point even to themselves at some level. And you have a coalescing kingship that expresses and interprets itself. And here I would like to make a brief quote of my colleague and friend Stephen Houston. To write or mark is to offer claims and lobby for their acceptance. A concrete durability enhances the effort. And finally, we have an assemblage that the material that we have is unique, and that in fact might very much have been pretty unique at the time. At least it's a question that needs to be asked, and perhaps there is therefore an experimental dimension in UJ. So in short, we have a window not on the state, whatever that might be in the late 4th millennium, but on early kingship. And kingship and state, that's not the same thing at all. We have not writing, but a perhaps experimental assemblage of non-linguistic emblems, which also raises the question with reference to JFK in slide number 4. What kind of a decipherment can we have here? And since we have been celebrating Champollion last year a lot, we really need to realize that this cannot be subjected to a linguistic decipherment like Egyptian writing in historical times would be. Quite to the contrary, if we want to understand anything in this material, we have to take a full measure of how different and, in a sense, weird it is relative to our horizons of expectation. So, sorry. Writing itself comes a century later. Here you have it, the earliest Egyptian writing in the late Dynasty 0, a few signs. Why is it writing? Well, because it's phonetic, but more than anything else, there is systematic or even systemic phoneticism without going into the details, you have recurrent spelling patterns, for example, recurrent signs with specific phonetic values. So there's something systemic here. And so there's a great measure of discontinuity with what precedes. There are many new signs, particularly the phonograms are generally entirely new signs, not found before. And there's an apparently, or at least very fast, immediately systemic phoneticism. But there's also a matter of continuity in the sense that some of the emblematic signs of before continue to be used, at least for some time, before dropping out of usage. So just an example of some of the emblems from the Coptos colossi that you find in an early First Dynasty seal associated with signs of writing. These things coexist for a short while, but there's continuity also on another level. So schematically, there's discontinuity at the level of the signs, at the systemic levels, but there's continuity on the surfaces of inscription and materiality and on the function of communicating power visually. So this should be an illustration of this notion of a continuity of material practices from the left-hand side, where you have Al-Hawi and UJ, which is not writing yet, and the right-hand side, late Dynasty 0, on the same type of surfaces, same type of practices, where it is writing and indeed phonetic writing. Well, here we have some of the signs that I discussed in my talk, the scorpion with a throw stick, or the lightning on the tags in UJ, and here in the tag of Kiminama, essentially I saw later, while you have the catfish wielding the mace, which essentially conveys the same message. But is of course recast visually. This notion of the striking force and inescapable blow associated with kingship is not all that different if we look at it that way. And here you have two more of these UJ signs, which you find in a very early tag of Aha, both of which would drop out of usage just after that. And so if you set these things in perspective, left-hand side, it's an emblem, this Bocranium on a pole, not writing at all. It's actually an emblem that goes back to Naqada 2 times, so it's even 200 years earlier, older than UJ. Whereas on the right-hand side, you have writing, so there's a categorical distinction, right? That's important, must be underscored. It happens within a century, so it's really important. But at the same time, there's something very similar in terms of material practices here. And here we may begin thinking of this very early writing as being itself a visual index of kingship, which is in fact natural because it's so highly restricted. So this vessel on the right-hand side, it functions visually, it delivers its most important message, even if you do not read any of the signs. You could read the signs, but basically it is marking a vessel by the signs that are themselves indexical of kingship. So the overall conclusion here on this development is that we have the perhaps somewhat paradoxical situation or development that phonetic writing, and it is thoroughly phonetic since the late Dynasty 0, develops in Egypt as an intensification of a visual culture. With this notion of sumptuosity, refinement, and exclusionary. Writing develops against the background of an increasingly exclusionary visual culture, and you add just one additional level of sophistication to make it even more exclusionary. And this additional level of sophistication, well, there are several of these, but one of these is phoneticism. And that is, of course, entirely contrary to our own naturalized Western ideologies of writing, but they are just what they are, which is probably very parochial. And so that's the final slide, which I think shows the development. So I thank you for your attention and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for this fascinating presentation.